Greetings, friends. My name is Joseph Kolakowski. I'm a Hasidic rabbi and I'm also a prison chaplain in a multi-faith setting. I'd like to give thanks to Almighty God for this opportunity that we have to share a few minutes together, and also to thank the Scranton area Ministerium for sponsoring this lecture. This week we're celebrating the 11th annual World Interfaith Harmony Week from the United Nations. And when I heard about this, which I'd really never heard about before, to be honest, the first thing that came to mind was that my work as a prison chaplain, which I've been involved in various capacities in prison ministry since 2009, when I thought about the idea of interfaith harmony, I realized that what goes on inside the prison could be a model for what happens on the outside. First of all, the idea of a prison, the idea of a Department of Corrections in general, even though it's been much maligned in modern days, is really a very lofty goal. We don't call this the Department of Punishment, the Department of Retribution. It's the Department of Corrections. The concept of corrections means that you can put someone back on the right path as opposed to where they were before. If someone comes into the Department of Corrections, it's because they need to be corrected. And our hope is that we provide even though I'm speaking just as an individual, and I'm not representing the Department of Corrections in any manner, even despite my employment. Our job is really to serve the community, to be of service. We're not making widgets. We're providing a service, and that service is the service of putting these men and women back into society better than how they came in. And the truth is, we can treat some symptoms of this, but actually, more than that, we, in the sense of justice, the sense of social justice, the sense of criminal justice reform, and so forth, what we should really be involved in corrections, is to not only correct that person who we are interacting with, but also correct society, that it should not be the type of society that produces people who need this correction. And so the Department of Corrections should be not only correcting those who are incarcerated, but doing a mission to correct society as a whole, so to eliminate the need for such corrections. Obviously, we're human beings, we're all filled with faults. And so there will never be a lack of a need for corrections. But nonetheless, we can always strive to be better than we were before. And in a certain sense, that's what we're dealing with here. This concept of harmony, and that we have to dedicate a week to interfaith harmony, kind of indicates that, as we all know, there is a lack of harmony. And we have to seek out a method by which to attain that harmony. And in many ways, I think the UN has a very positive role model for us in attaining that harmony. One of the things that the UN is well known for is that there are United Nations World Heritage Sites, and that there's a concept of trying to preserve an aspect of world heritage. And world heritage does not only have to be that of a site, but it can also be that of a concept of a movement, and so forth. And so the heritage that exists in the plethora of expressions of spirituality and religion in the world also deserve to be protected as an aspect of the world heritage. And protecting an aspect of world heritage means that it does not get lost. We can be united without losing our individual identity. We can have all the various translators and interpreters and ambassadors that exist, for example, in the United Nations, in order to maintain peace and harmony without losing the individual identity that may exist in the plurality and diversity of expressions, including the expressions of religion and other cultural expressions that exist in the world. It's often said that a prison is like a town. You have the population that lives there, and you have the population that works there and doesn't necessarily live there. Although many people might live in a town and work there too, which is the same thing in a prison. The inmates who live here work here as well. And in any town, you have a store, you have a doctor, perhaps a hospital, you have a barber shop, you have various industries, and also, in just about any town you'll find, even very small towns, you'll have a church, and maybe more than just a church, many different churches, perhaps a synagogue or many different synagogues, mosque or mosques, and other religious communities of various kinds. The thing is that in general, on the street, as we say, most people are going to go to the same doctors. Many people are going to shop at the same stores, maybe not everyone. People of different backgrounds and cultures generally will be working together in industry and services. But when it comes to religious services, we tend to stick to our own. We have our community, and maybe for good reason we stick to our own community. Many of our own religious traditions will teach us that we're not supposed to be going to someone else's church. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I'm from such a tradition. But nonetheless, how do we accomplish harmony? And how do we use, perhaps, as I've seen, as I've experienced, like I said, since 2009, working in prison ministry, how do we use this as a model for something that can be used, as we say, on the street, on the outside? In prisons, we encounter different religions than we might on the street. It's one of the challenges, actually, of prison ministry. And I think something that I believe that the Scranton area Ministerium would be interested in having people be aware of. It's often a difficulty, particularly in prisons that are located in rural areas, as many prisons are, to find volunteers or even paid chaplains to serve some of the smaller religions, some of the minority religions that exist in the prison. And yet it's our desire to serve all. It's our job to serve all, because this is a free country, thank God. We have no established religion. We don't have one single Church of America. And so it's our job in a prison to make sure that everybody, to the best of our ability, has access to the services that they need, which would mean all the various expressions of religion should have some kind of access. It doesn't necessarily mean a paid chaplain, could be It could be a volunteer chaplain, or it could be a visitor in the visiting room who was a spiritual advisor. But everyone should have some sort of an outlet, some sort of a connection to the outside, and we try to our best to facilitate that, but sometimes it's difficult. And so when we want to serve every religion that we have here, we have to put in some little extra effort, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. You know, most of us are familiar with some of the major religions that exist, but quite often we've heard of what happens in other countries, but we're not so familiar with, we might not have a connection locally. We might not even know anybody who belongs to some of the very large religions that exist throughout the world. Yeah, but the truth of the matter is that when we're in a prison setting, and people might be sent from anywhere in the state to be housed in a prison facility, you're going to have a diversity of religions that you're not going to necessarily run into on the street, or you might run into and be unaware of that. We don't know necessarily what are the religious beliefs of anyone that we encounter at work or in our lives, unless there's someone who's a member of our own religious communities in general. But we run into the major religions, all various types of Christianity and Islam and Judaism in the prison, but we don't always realize that there are other religious expressions, other religious communities, some of which you might have never heard of before coming to work or be in a prison otherwise. Or some that you might have, and I think this is really the crux of what I want to express here. There's going to be some that you probably heard something about, never encountered, and maybe have heard something negative about them. I know that's been my experience, that growing up, you hear about these various groups, these various communities, that, oh, they all hate this group, and I might be part of that second group that they hate. And so there might be a certain fear of people from a certain community. But when you actually meet them, instead of just hearing things, you know, from people who've never met people from these communities, you find out that we're not all that different. We might disagree on certain things. Everybody disagrees with everybody on something. But they're not these evil monsters that we might imagine them to be. And I think that's a core aspect of how we gain interfaith harmony, is by interacting with people of these other faiths, including those that we might have negative beliefs about. I know I had always heard about one particular religion, the Nation of Islam, who were the followers of the Minister Louis Farrakhan. And I always heard negative things about this group. And I remember my first professional prison chaplaincy work was at a federal prison down in Virginia, where my first synagogue was as well. I was the rabbi of the synagogue in Richmond, Virginia for a number of years, and very part-time I was a prison chaplain ministering to the Jewish community in 3 prisons within a complex about 40 minutes south of Richmond in a federal prison. And although my main ministry was to the Jewish community or anybody who was interested in learning about Judaism, anybody who wanted to meet with me for whatever reason, every now and then I would meet other inmates. And there were many encounters that were important to me. There was one that really sticks with me as far as this question of interfaith harmony, because it breaks all the stereotypes. And I believe this was the first time that I had knowledgeably met with a member of the Nation of Islam, which is very different theologically than what would be called Orthodox Islam, the traditional branches of the Sunni and the Shia. And this inmate, he told me that his mother, I think maybe even his grandparents, were members of Nation of Islam. And he was very friendly to me. And I don't remember our whole conversation. We had a nice, brief conversation. And I don't even remember how he segued to bringing this up. But he said, and you have to understand that the Nation of Islam had some differences with someone who was rightfully venerated in the United States of America, given his own day. Practically, I would say, an American saint that crosses all borders, not certainly outside of only his own tradition of being a Baptist minister and pastor, was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who we all venerate highly and who deserves that veneration. But we know that there were some differences between the ideology of the Nation of Islam with Malcolm X at the time and others, and their ideology and Dr. King's ideology. And yet this man, who was a member of the Nation of Islam, said to me, and I'm not a Christian, I'm very obviously a Hasidic Jew, I'm not a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, and he, as a member of the Nation of Islam, although they do venerate Jesus, their idea of Jesus is very different than that of how most Christians would view Jesus. It's different how Muslims, traditional Muslims, view it as well. But he said to me, and this was fascinating, he said that Dr. Martin Luther King was the most Christ-like person in the 20th century. Now, I'm sure that Dr. King would be honored to hear that, because that was his whole goal in life as a Christian minister, to emulate the example of his Christ. But when I thought about that, I realized, and I've mentioned this many times over the years in various forums, I realized that what this young man was saying, it had a lot of merit to it. Because like Jesus of Nazareth, how he's presented in Christian scripture, Dr. King was killed unjustly when he was in his 30s, and his message became stronger after his martyrdom than it did in his life, although his ministry was very strong in his lifetime. And so that really opened up my eyes. Now, I'm not stating this as much to make any theological statement, because it's not my theology, it's not my tradition. I almost feel inadequate to mention such a thing, because I don't want to be stepping on the toes of my Christian neighbors by making this statement, and it's not my statement, I'm quoting what I heard. The reason I'm telling this story is not because of necessarily the message of what this young man was telling me, as much as to show how this encounter probably would have never happened anywhere else, but it should happen elsewhere. It should be something that one should be able to encounter. And the depth of that encounter that I had as a prison chaplain, speaking to a person of a radically different faith, although it's radically different, we have much in common, despite all that. And that's really what is the power of Interfaith Harmony. I don't stop being Jewish. He doesn't stop being a Nation of Islam. We're both appreciating another religion, Christianity. and a major figure, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., from that tradition, from the Christian tradition, who we've all embraced here in the United States and in the world. And it's really, really a powerful, powerful message. That we can have a dialogue, we can have appreciation, we can have harmony. I can't say, oh, I'm not talking to him because he's from a group of people who don't like people like me. No. Sometimes we might take risks doing that, but I think in the end those risks are worthwhile. There's a website that people ask questions. It's called Quora. And people answer questions, and I every now and then like to answer the questions in Quora. Sometimes the people send me directly the questions. And a number of years ago I saw a question, I believe it was on Quora. It might have been on Facebook or somewhere else. And it says, what does a pastor, a priest, and a rabbi, and an imam, if they're all sitting in a room together, what do they talk about? I'd like to be a fly on the wall. And the truth of the matter is, sometimes, maybe often, we talk about religion. Most of the time we've got to talk about our work. If we have an official meeting all together, we're going to talk about what do we have to do for our work? What do we have to do to fulfill our jobs, to serve the men that we are dedicated to be serving here? Most of all, we find that even though the priest and the deacon might have their collar, and and I might have my kaftan and my hat or my yarmulke, we're all different. We all look different, but we're all human beings. And we can share jokes with each other, talk about movies we saw, or the news and politics, and we could just all get along. And so when I mentioned that, it was a little bit disappointing because they were expecting very deep discussions of theology and so forth, which we sometimes might have. But for the most part, we just talk about normal things, and that should not be a disappointment. You see, so often we're looking for something that's really exciting, and exotic. Oh wow, it's not just that the priest and the rabbi and the minister walk into the bar. Obviously the imam's not going to be there, right? It's not just a joke. It's a serious thing. You want to hear deep discussions of theology and the differences between the different faiths and so forth. And we all have our differences, and we respect our differences, and we celebrate our differences. But in the end, what we have in common is we're just some people. We're just human beings. And we're doing what we have to do. And that simplicity and that normalcy, that it's not some big deal. Oh, we're going and we have some big crusade that we're going to go and be making Interfaith Harmony. No, just making it normal. Just living a normal life and coexisting and having that harmony. That is so much greater than any lofty spiritual and theological discussions and philosophical discussions. Beyond that, one of the things that's fascinating to me as someone who is in the multi-faith setting not trying to change anybody, trying my best to minister to people of other faiths and of my own faith in a way that's fair to everybody, doing the things that we have to do, doing my job. But part of the excitement of it is I get to learn about other religions. Here, I'm a supervisor in my current position, and I supervise all the religions that are here. And I get to learn about them. I actually was considering a position in another state where I would only be the rabbi, so to speak. I would be ministering to the Jewish community full-time in several prisons. And I realized that would kind of be boring to me. I would much rather have that plurality. And one thing that I've learned, we have all different types of religions in the prison. Now with the past year or two, with the lockdowns in reaction to the pandemic, we had to be a little bit creative in how we serve our different faith traditions. It was difficult to bring people in, volunteers and so forth, which we had before the lockdowns. We had a volunteer who served the Hindus and the Buddhists, and we had for the Jehovah's Witnesses, and for various reasons we don't have those currently. The one thing that came up that was recommended and that we embraced here is that we could find videos on YouTube and other places and broadcast them to the inmates. They don't have direct internet access. So we can curate a list of videos and make them available. And so I took upon, and even though we've opened up since then, we show 12 different traditions or groups of traditions every week where I'm serving, and I'm in charge of that. And so on Monday morning we have the Eastern traditions, like I said, the Buddhists, the Hindus, even though we don't have any Sikh inmates. Right now we don't have any Hindu inmates either. But we might show a lecture about Sikhism, or educational materials, or about Jainism or other, or Taoism, that people can be educated about these different traditions. That's Monday morning. Then Monday afternoon, the Native American spiritual traditions, and we do have a Native American chaplain to serve that community. Tuesday morning, we show for the Wiccan community, and Tuesday afternoon for the Jehovah's Witnesses. Wednesday morning we show for the Mormons, and Wednesday afternoon for the Jewish community. Thursday morning we show for the Nation of Islam that we mentioned before, and Thursday afternoon for the Odinists, the Asatru, the Norse pagan traditions. Friday morning we show for traditions that are from the African diaspora, the Rastafarian and the Santeria, Yoruba, and the Ma'at traditions. And Friday afternoon we show a Muslim video, traditional Sunni Muslim video. And Sunday morning, a Protestant Christian video. And Sunday afternoon, a Roman Catholic Christian video. And so each tradition has about 2 hours a week, and if there's room on the DVD, we show it over and over again. So it might be shown 2 or 3 times. And I have to watch those videos, make sure they're appropriate. And so I get to learn about these different traditions. And then beyond that, we do our best to have chaplains to serve, whether full-time, part-time, or volunteer. And at various times, like I said, we had an Eastern tradition, Buddhist and Hindu volunteer. We had a Wiccan volunteer. We still have an Odinist, Asatru volunteer. We had Jehovah's Witness volunteers. We have paid chaplains who are Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Christian, Muslim, Native American, Jewish. And we get to learn about these different traditions. And part of the fun, for me, I always love to learn about different religions, is to see, although we are certainly different, and we know our differences, and we respect our differences, but to see how much we are the same. You know, Jungian psychology teaches that religion was the grand force that essentially domesticated humanity. Without religion, we'd essentially be animals. In a sense, it's religion that separates us from the animals. From the other animals, we should say. And spirituality. I also work for the Office of Mental Health in New York, and as a chaplain as well. And I was given a guide to spirituality groups, which are supposed to be non-denominational and have universal appeal. And Albany defines spirituality at its lowest common denominator, which is its greatest common denominator, as being that which makes life meaningful. Which means even if a person does not believe in anything supernatural, they are still spiritual. Because spirituality is not only about souls and angels and God, but spirituality is about meaning. And I say that meaning often is that which we have that animals don't have. And so obviously religion is a spiritual pursuit, but there are everything becomes spiritual if you recognize it as such. And you don't let yourself become lost. You don't let yourself become just a zombie, just a vegetable, which is very important in an institutionalized community, whether it be a mental facility or whether it be a correctional facility. This idea of spirituality is really essential. It's not just for the religious people. It's not just for the people who go to church or go to the mosque or go to the synagogue or the Native American ceremony. Spirituality is integral and essential in the essence of what it means to be a human. And it would protect a person from becoming institutionalized, because that is something that we don't want to see. One of the Hasidic masters, Rabbi Danziger of Alexander in Poland, said that the Ten Commandments begin with the words that I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. He asked, why does it say the house of slavery? Why doesn't it just say, I took you out of slavery? The Jewish tradition says there are no extra words in the Bible. Every word, every letter is put by God for a reason. And so the Rebbe of Alexander says that the house of slavery means that they felt at home in their slavery. They became institutionalized. And God set them free from that feeling of feeling at home within their slavery. That doesn't mean you don't make the best of the bad situation you're in. It means that you don't get so comfortable that you don't want to leave. And that's not only about prison, that's about every prison that we find ourselves in. I often tell inmates here that a lot of folks in here are more free, because they're free on the inside, than a lot of folks who are out on the street, who are imprisoned by their own issues, their own addictions. And so spirituality obviously includes religion, and maybe the things that we would call spiritual but not religious, people who enjoy meditation and yoga, things like that, which are actually coming from religious traditions, but maybe they're expressing it without the religious bounds, which the etymology of the word religion means something that one is bound to, a binding. But things like art and music are very obviously spiritual. Now obviously religions use art and music, but outside of religious context, I think most people can understand that appreciating art, music, drama, film, drama began really as a religious expression in ancient Greece. That all of these things can be spiritual without being religious, right? But then you could take it a step further down. Things like science, math, history, politics, they're all spiritual. Now, first of all, every religion has a history. Most religions have some kind of political interest. Most religions have something to say about science. Many religions have math as part of their sacred ideology, numerology, and so forth. But in and of themselves, outside the religious context, these things give meaning to life. Meaning, the way I say it is that we as Americans look at George Washington in a very special way as our first president. He's somewhat like a Jungian archetype, as is, you know, Jefferson and Franklin, and later on Lincoln, and later on Kennedy, and even other, not only politicians, but we mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King, other figures, Gandhi. And within our own traditions, we all have our own saints that we venerate within our traditions, even if we don't use that term necessarily. But people who have gotten to a level where they're essentially like a Jungian archetype. And the idea that I want to bring out here is that all of these things are spiritual, meaning with no disrespect to the animals. But I don't think a Dalmatian dog thinks about the first Dalmatian to get the AKC recognition as their patriarch. The way that we look at the father of our country, the way we look at Washington, the way we look at Lincoln. So in that way there's meaning, and in that way there is spirituality to history. And the same thing, science, math. Animals don't think about these things the way we as humans do. And so that means that there's meaning in these things, even in the secular sense. That secular sense is nonetheless spiritual, in the sense that we say spirituality means that which makes your life meaningful, in the broadest sense of the term. But nonetheless, we find that between these various traditions that I interact with, we find we have so much in common, because we're all human beings. And the religious expressions, although they are different, although they have diversity and plurality, nonetheless there are some common bonds that we all share. Carl Jung was very famous to say that he had a theory of the collective unconscious, which could be a scientific understanding of things that are understood to be spiritual, other realms and other levels in heaven, and angels and ghosts and demons and so forth. That these things have a reality that can be measured scientifically through the study of psychology. Dr. Jung was very famous that when he was asked if he believed in God, he said he doesn't believe, he knows there's a God, which is what Maimonides teaches, that Judaism, my tradition teaches. It's not a matter of faith, but Deuteronomy says you were shown to know that the Lord is God. Again, I'm not pushing my religion, I'm rather trying to share that there are similarities between the various traditions. And so when I mention these various traditions I interact with, and obviously Christianity and Islam have a lot in common with Judaism because they came from that same root of Judaism. Obviously Judaism has changed over the years as well, but nonetheless we're all coming from that common ancestry. But nonetheless, even within the various traditions, meaning I come from a particularly Hungarian approach to Hasidic Judaism, which embraces some religious conservatism, but also some religious fervor and charisma and revivalism and mysticism. And I find that in these other traditions as well, meaning one of our chaplains here is an Eastern Orthodox Christian priest, and quite often he takes me over to seminary over here, St. Tikhon's, where he's a professor, and we actually have the men who are becoming priests. They'll come here, or they might already be ordained as priests. They have an internship in the prison, and I realize it's not just the beard and the long coats and the hats that we have in common with the Russian Orthodox or other Eastern Orthodox Christian priests, but the way they venerate their saints. It's very similar to how the Hasidic Jews venerate our tzaddikim, essentially our saints. Their traditions of music, which also we have very strong musical traditions. Other things are different. Obviously, their iconography is something that's very foreign to us. And so we see our differences and we see our similarities, and obviously also our theology is obviously different. But we can see, even the truth is, culturally, the similarities, things that are expressed in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, the idea of the kollel, where a rabbinical student will be paid and be married, and I've often said that the kollel is the Jewish equivalent of a monastery, except you're married with children. But then the priests in the seminary there, who are not in the monastery, there's a monastery there as well, they're married with children as well, and they're also paid to study and devote themselves to their faith. And I found the same thing in the Islamic community. There's a very large Turkish community in the Lehigh Valley area, the followers of the very famous Islamic scholar Fethullah Gulen, who was exiled from Turkey and resides here in Pennsylvania. And many of his students have gone into prison chaplaincy. And again, they have that kind of a kollel idea. The way they venerate Imam Gulen is very much like a Hasidic Rebbe is treated. The way that he's looked upon in their traditions. And there our theologies are much similar, obviously, and our liturgy and so forth, and our traditions are very, very similar between Judaism and Islam. Obviously, most of the things I said about the Orthodox Church could say about the Catholic Church as well. And our interactions there as well are very special. And then the Protestants, some of them evangelical, we get along, ideas about Scripture, Holy Land, and so forth. But those are to be expected because we come from similar roots. But when you cut to very different traditions, get to the Eastern traditions, the Buddhists, the Hindus, and we find that their manner of meditation is not that different from that which is taught from some of the Hasidic masters. We get to the Native Americans, and we see their traditions of music and dance and storytelling are very much very similar to the Hasidic traditions of music and dance and storytelling. Even a lot of their use of herbs and so forth, even though that's not as important in Hasidism as it is in the Native American traditions, we find those balances, those similarities. Even some of the early Hasidic masters said that there's a sacred aspect of tobacco, which is extremely sacred to the Native American traditions. And even some of the other traditions, the Wiccans and the Odinists, the neo-pagan religions, again, we find that these are theologically so different than us, and yet we can find surprisingly a lot of common ground. But beyond that, just seeing that we can be friends, maybe me and the Odinist minister who comes in here, we talk about politics, we see we're on the same page, and me and the Native American chaplain will talk about cartoons that we like, things. And that would not happen, certainly for someone who is very religiously conservative like me. The average Hasidic Jew does not interact, unless it's maybe some kind of a business dealing, with people of these other faiths, unless you're a prison chaplain, right? That's really the only time that you see these types of things. And I'm not the only one, although most of my fellow rabbis who are in this work are part-time, they have a different approach. But nonetheless, you wind up learning that we have so much more in common than we have that's different, and we learn about ourselves more through that. On World Interfaith Harmony Week.com, they had a collection, a PDF file, with 200 quotes from various traditions, some of which I was already familiar with and I'd like to share and reflect on as we conclude here. We mentioned Gandhi before, who's, I think, certainly also an archetypical figure. And he was a very pious Hindu priest, I believe, religious figure. And he writes, I hold as the duty, even though he started his life as a lawyer, he said, I hold as the duty of every cultured man and woman to read sympathetically the scriptures of the world. If we are to respect others' religions as we would have them respect our own, our friendly study of world's religions is a sacred duty. My respectful study of other religions has not abated my reverence for or my faith in the Hindu scriptures, says Gandhi. They have indeed left deep mark upon my understanding of the Hindu scriptures. They have broadened my view of life. They have enabled me to understand more clearly many an obscure passage in the Hindu scriptures. And I would say it's the same thing, my experience with learning these other religions. When I learn about other religions, I don't lose myself. I learn more about myself. I learn more about why I believe what I believe. And so interacting with others and listening to others is a way that you can learn about yourself. Another archetypical person, someone I once made a pilgrimage to his grave in Elmira, New York, was Mark Twain. And Mark Twain, he was famously, he traveled the world and wrote about it, but, not only did he write many novels, but he was a journalist who traveled all over the world. And, a lot of people don't know that he's from more or less this area, not too far from here. Elmira is right over the border from Pennsylvania. Because we think of him being on the Mississippi River, but that's because he was able to travel and learn about the world. And he says that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Now, I understand it's not always easy to travel. I had an opportunity actually to travel to India on a mission trip recently, and I had to turn it down because of the situation in the world and the uncertainty of the reactions to these uncertainties. And even though I would have probably certainly gained much more from traveling, we gain something from reading, but we gain more from interacting. And nowadays we can interact with people all over the world, and we can make ways, with these Zoom and all these other technologies, we can actually have a discussion with someone in India or in China or in Africa or South America without physically traveling to those places. In our tradition, the Hasidic tradition, it says from the Baal Shem Tov, wherever your thoughts are, that's where you are. And I think by learning about these others, we lose these types of bigotry. I know I myself, I've faced some backlash about my openness within my own community to other traditions. And I wonder, why are people so afraid of interacting with the other? And part of it is that fear that you might lose yourself. But if you're secure enough in who you are, you're not going to lose anything. If anything, you're going to gain yourself. You're going to be stronger in who you are. But we mentioned Carl Jung, and again, one of the quotes that's on the WorldInterfaithHarmonyWeek.com website says, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's a very deep statement from a very deep man, someone who, even though he himself was not Jewish, he studied the depths of Jewish mysticism, and many of his Jewish students considered him to be kind of like a holy rabbi in many ways to them, a tzaddik, a saint. And Dr. Jung is saying that it is that darkness that we, in a sense, have to embrace, because it's only in imagination that it's darkness. Like I began our story with, I had always heard negative things about Nation of Islam, or might have heard negative things about the Odinists and others. But actually meeting them, actually fellowshipping, interacting, you see we have much more in common than we have that's different. And that's something, this very famous quote that another person who's become an archetype was Albert Einstein. And there's a fascinating story that after World War II, there was another Orthodox Jewish rabbi who was a chaplain, a military chaplain, who, after saving so many people's lives, rescuing people, helping people during World War II and after World War II in the DP camps, he comes home to America and one of his children unfortunately becomes ill and passes away. And this rabbi was looking for help, looking for guidance. And it's interesting, you would have thought he would have turned to one of his rabbis or maybe another rabbi. And I'm sure he did that as well. But he also wrote a letter to Albert Einstein asking for his insight. And Professor Einstein said, he wrote back to this grieving rabbi, this chaplain, "Although we human beings are part of a whole, the universe, we experience ourselves as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of our consciousnesses." I'm wondering if he got that from Leo Gorcey. I showed that to Leo Gorcey's daughter, actually. I said, I wonder if Einstein was a fan of the Bowery Boys. But he said, "This delusion is a prison for us." Back to the quote. Again, we're talking about prison, right? "Restricting us to our personal desires and affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole nature of it in its beauty." And although it's not quoted here, he said that our obligation is not to feed this optical delusion, but to be rid of it. This delusion that we are not all one. Again, if we come from a monotheistic tradition, we believe we all come from that one source. And so we are all essentially one. I'm not putting down the other traditions, I'm just making that statement. And it's interesting that he wrote this to someone who was in very deep grief. Because the truth is, if you feel grief for something very personal, which is appropriate, we sometimes have to ask, why don't we feel that grief for the universal? The problem is that it could be very numbing, it could be overwhelming. But we don't have to only wait for times of sadness to search for that which is good. We don't have to be in prison to find that interfaith harmony. we learn from these lessons. You know, I'm always reminded of, there was an episode of Seinfeld where the character George, he's talking to his therapist, and he tells the therapist, God won't let me be successful. And the therapist said, George, I thought you told me you don't believe in God. And he said, well, I do for the bad things. And I remember Rabbi Kolakowski from Denver, he lives in Brooklyn now, he says, you know, when he was a kid in yeshiva, they used to throw water balloons out the window. He said, you should make a God balloon with all the negative things. Instead of filling up a balloon with water, fill up the balloon with negative ideas about God and throw that out the window, because there are very positive things. If you're a believer in God, to focus on the positive, think about the good. And if you're not a believer, whatever makes your life meaningful, focus on the good, focus on the positive. Don't wait for a disaster. Don't wait to be in the foxhole. Find the good and the harmony between everything that exists in the world, in the celebration of diversity, and in a simplistic form. It doesn't have to be fancy. You didn't discover America, you know. You're finding something that's really inherent in who you are. You're finding something that's very basic and normal. So it doesn't have to be exotic and exciting. We don't have to exotify anything. Rather, we celebrate and respect differences, just like we respect other people. We don't act in someone else's home the way we act in our own home. We have that modicum of respect. We don't cross boundaries, and we're not disrespectful. But nonetheless, we recognize the potential for good, the potential for harmony. We can preserve the heritage of the world and not let it be lost, not let it be assimilated, but also not let it be a source of hatred or division, but rather a celebration of diversity with unity, e pluribus unum. Those very basic things that unite us, and those many things that we have difference that we can celebrate, should all be embraced, and we don't need to be in prison to do that. Rather, like Einstein said, we have to be freed from the prison of delusion, the prison of separation, and embrace that which unifies us without losing who we are. And I think that's what World Interfaith Harmony Week is all about. For more information about World Interfaith Harmony Week, please visit www.worldinterfaithharmonyweek.com. And for more information about the Scranton area Ministerium, you can find them online as well as their Facebook group. Thank you for watching. All the best to you. God bless. And you can follow me also. I'm Rabbi Joseph Kolakowski. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, a few other places. I'd love to speak with anybody. God bless.